The emergency diplomatic summit aboard Nexus Prime's Grand Assembly Hall had been deteriorating for hours. General Korth Vex of the Hegemony War Council, his massive exoskeleton, gleaming with military decorations earned in campaigns across 17 different systems, was rapidly losing patience with what he considered to be an inferior species' stubborn negotiating tactics. "The terms are non-negotiable," he rumbled, his translated words carrying the harmonic undertones of absolute authority. "The human colonies in the disputed sectors will submit to hegemony oversight or face military intervention." Across the diplomatic table, Commander Elena Vasquez, recently returned to diplomatic service after her stint in military command, maintained the calm professionalism that had served her throughout decades of interspecies negotiations. She wore simple civilian clothes rather than military uniform, and her relaxed posture suggested someone completely unbothered by the threats being leveled against her species. "General Korth Vex," she replied, in perfectly modulated Standard Galactic. "I appreciate your position, but humanity's sovereignty over those colonies is well established under galactic law. We're happy to discuss trade agreements or mutual defense pacts, but territorial concessions are off the table." Ambassador Thexlan of the Crorian Collective shifted nervously in his environmental pod, his forearms creating subtle harmonics of distress. The diplomatic situation had been tense since the hegemony had begun expanding aggressively into human space, but he had hoped that reasonable negotiations could prevent another interstellar incident. General Korth Vex's compound eyes fixed on Elena with what his species considered a threat display. At nearly 3 meters tall and possessing natural armor plating that could deflect small arms fire, he was accustomed to using his physical presence to intimidate opponents during negotiations. "Commander Vasquez," he said, rising from his reinforced chair to loom over the human diplomat, "I believe you fail to grasp the gravity of this situation. The hegemony does not make requests, we issue ultimatums." Elena looked up at the towering alien general with mild interest, as if she were observing an unusual but not particularly threatening specimen. "General, intimidation tactics don't work particularly well on humans. You might want to try a different approach." The casual dismissal of his authority struck General Korth Vex like a physical blow. Throughout his military career, he had dominated negotiations through a combination of superior firepower and psychological pressure. No species had ever responded to his threats with such indifference. "You dare show disrespect to a hegemony general?" he snarled, his translation implants struggling to convey the full depth of his outrage. "I'm showing respect for diplomatic protocol," Elena replied calmly. "You're the one threatening military action against civilian populations. That's generally considered poor form in civilized negotiations." Around the assembly hall, other diplomatic observers watched the exchange with growing unease. The hegemony was known for their aggressive expansion policies, but they had never directly threatened human territories before. Most species assumed that humanity's recent military victories had been the result of superior technology or favorable circumstances, not an indication of fundamental capability differences. General Korth Vex was about to educate them all on the dangers of that assumption. "Civilized?" His voice rose to frequencies that caused several species' translation matrices to overload. "Your species evolved on a death world. You are primitives who learned to use tools. The hegemony has conquered 17 sectors through military might and strategic superiority." Elena's expression remained perfectly neutral. "That's an impressive resume, General. How many of those 17 sectors fought back?" The question hung in the air like a verbal landmine. General Korth Vex had spent his career conquering species that submitted after token resistance, choosing survival over prolonged conflict. The idea that any species would actually want to fight the hegemony was foreign to his experience. "Resistance is futile when facing superior force," he declared. Submission is the logical choice. Interesting perspective, Elena mused. Humans tend to have a different philosophy about submission. The general's frustration finally boiled over into action that would haunt him for the rest of his considerably shortened career. Moving with the lightning speed that had made him famous in hegemony military circles, he struck Elena across the face with what his species considered a disciplinary slap, a gesture designed to establish dominance through controlled violence. The sound of exoskeleton, reinforced appendage meeting human flesh, echoed through the assembly hall like a gunshot. General Korthvex immediately realized he had made a catastrophic error. Elena's head had barely moved from the impact. She reached up casually, touched her cheek where a small bruise was forming, and looked at the general with an expression that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. "General," she said conversationally, "you just committed an act of war against a human diplomat under the protection of galactic law." "That was merely a disciplinary gesture," Korthvex stammered, suddenly aware that something fundamental had changed in the diplomatic equation. "On human terms," Elena continued, rising from her chair with fluid grace, "what you just did constitutes assault on a diplomatic representative that carries some very specific consequences." She tapped her communication device, and her voice suddenly carried throughout the hall with crystal clarity. "This is Commander Elena Vasquez to Earth Command, confirming hostile action against Terran diplomatic personnel by Hegemony General Korthvex. Request immediate implementation of Response Protocol 7. Ambassador Thexland's forearms began trembling uncontrollably. He had heard references to human response protocols in classified intelligence briefings, but had assumed they were theoretical deterrent policies rather than actual operational doctrines. "Commander," he interjected urgently, "surely this can be resolved through diplomatic channels." "The diplomatic channel was General Korthvex striking a human ambassador," Elena replied calmly. "That particular channel has been permanently closed." General Korthvex felt the first stirrings of genuine fear as he processed the implications of Elena's casual demeanor. She wasn't angry, wasn't emotional, wasn't even particularly concerned. She was simply proceeding. "What is Response Protocol 7? He asked, though part of him desperately didn't want to know. Elena's smile was pleasant and absolutely terrifying. "Protocol 7 is what happens when someone physically attacks a human diplomat. It's quite comprehensive." Her communication device chimed softly. "Commander Vasquez, this is Admiral Chen. Protocol 7 authorization confirmed. Fleet deployment commencing. Estimated time to target, 47 minutes. The blood drained from General Korthvex's carapace as the full magnitude of his mistake became clear. Somewhere in space, human military forces were moving in response to his momentary loss of control. "How many ships?" he whispered. "All of them," Elena replied matter-of-factly. "Protocol 7 requires proportional response to diplomatic assault. Since you represent the entire Hegemony Military Command, the appropriate response is the complete neutralization of Hegemony military capability." The assembly hall erupted in chaos as 43 different species simultaneously began emergency consultations with their home governments. Several ambassadors immediately began drafting formal condemnations of the hegemony's actions, while others started calculating how quickly they could evacuate their personnel from hegemony space. "This is insane," General Korthvex protested. "I barely touched you. This is completely disproportionate." Elena examined her bruised cheek in a reflective surface. "General, you made two critical errors. First, you assumed that physical intimidation would work on humans. Second, you forgot that humans are really good at holding grudges." She gathered her diplomatic materials with the same methodical precision that had characterized human actions throughout their brief galactic presence. For what it's worth, she added, I tried to warn you that intimidation doesn't work on my species. We've spent millennia fighting each other, dealing with external threats. It's actually kind of relaxing. As she walked toward the exit, her communication device provided a final update. All hegemony military installations have been neutralized. 17 sectors liberated. Hegemony command structure has surrendered unconditionally. Protocol 7 implementation complete. Elena paused at the threshold and looked back at General Korth Vex, who had collapsed into his chair in complete psychological breakdown. General, she said pleasantly, the next time you feel like slapping a diplomat, I'd recommend checking their species response protocols first. Some of us take that sort of thing personally. The short video of Elena calmly ordering the complete dismantling of the hegemony military while sporting a small bruise on her cheek would become the most watched diplomatic recording in galactic history, serving as a permanent reminder that some species' definition of proportional response includes the complete annihilation of anyone foolish enough to test their patience.